The house was too quiet for a Monday morning. At 5:48 a.m., the sun had barely touched the rooftops of Frederick, Colorado, when flashing red and blue lights washed over a picture-perfect suburban street. Police cars lined the curb outside a beige two-story home with white trim, a place that looked more like a real estate brochure in the center of an unfolding
Ladies and gentlemen of the press,
The lawn was
I
trimmed.
stand before you
The
tonight
garage
to
door was
address a
closed.
matter of utmost
Nothing was
importance.
broken.
I stand before you
Nothing
tonight
was
to address the
disturbed.
allegations
And yet,
that have surfaced.
Shauna and
I want to be
Watson,
clear,
her
I have
two
done
young
nothing wrong.
daughters, Bella and Celeste, were gone. Inside the house, the silence felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. Shannon's phone lay abandoned on the kitchen counter. Her purse was still there, wallet inside. The girls' blankets were folded neatly. Their shoes sat untouched by the door. Mothers didn't leave like this. Children didn't vanish without noise. Every detail screamed the same truth. Whatever happened here, it wasn't planned by the people who disappeared. Standing just outside the front door was Chris Watts. He wore a plain T-shirt, jeans, and an expression that didn't quite match the situation. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't pacing. He didn't raise his voice or demand answers. Instead, he clasped his hands together, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes darting just enough to seem concerned, but not enough to seem afraid. Chris told police the same story he told everyone else. He said Sean Ann had returned from a business trip late the night before. They had an emotional conversation. She was upset. Then, sometime after that, she left with the girls. No note, no call, no explanation. As he spoke, his voice stayed even. Too even. Officers exchanged quick glances. They'd seen this before. In missing person cases, panic usually came first. Anger followed. Desperation. But Chris Watts radiated something else entirely, a strange calm, like a man trying very hard to remember his lines. Neighbors gathered behind police tape as the morning stretched on. One of them, a man who lived just next door, stepped forward with unease etched across his face. He told officers something that made the investigation shift instantly. Just hours earlier, he'd noticed Chris backing his truck into the driveway, something he almost never did. The movement was awkward, rushed, and it happened in the dark. That detail landed hard. Police asked Chris if he would come down to the station to answer more questions. He agreed without hesitation. No lawyer, no resistance, just a nod and a quiet, okay. As he walked toward a patrol car, cameras captured his face, eyes blinking too fast, lips pressed together as if holding something in. At the station, detectives began with simple questions. How long had he and Shannon been married? Were they having problems? Was there anyone else involved? Chris answered smoothly, describing a loving family, minor disagreements, nothing serious. He spoke about his daughters with rehearsed affection, calling them my little girls, his voice cracking at precisely the moments it was expected to. But beneath the surface, the story didn't sit right. Detectives noticed how Chris avoided certain details, how he circled around timelines, how his words felt practiced, like he'd already said them out loud, maybe more than once. And then there was his body language. When asked about Shannon's return time, his foot tapped. When asked why she would leave without her phone, he swallowed hard. When asked if he knew where they were now, his eyes dropped to the table. Outside the interrogation room, investigators were already pulling data. Phone records, text messages, credit card activity, surveillance footage from nearby homes. Every minute that passed without activity from Shannon's phone made the situation more dire. No calls, no pings, nothing. Then came the first crack. A detective casually asked Chris if Shannon was pregnant. He paused. Just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Yes, he said. She was. The room felt colder after that. A pregnant woman doesn't disappear voluntarily. A pregnant woman doesn't leave her children behind. That single fact turned concern into alarm and suspicion into something far darker. Meanwhile, Chris agreed to speak to the media. Standing on his front porch, surrounded by cameras, he begged for his family's return. He spoke about wanting to hug those kids again, about hoping Shannon would just come home. But as the words left his mouth, something felt off. There were no tears, no urgency, just a man playing the role of a worried husband, missing the emotion that made it real. Viewers across the country felt it instantly. Something about him didn't add up. Back at the station, detectives received a notification that made the room go silent. Shannon's phone had finally been accessed. Inside were messages she'd sent hours before disappearing. Messages describing fear, betrayal, and a marriage on the brink of collapse. And buried deeper still was something even more disturbing. A secret Chris Watts never mentioned. A double life. As investigators stared at the screen, the case shifted from a missing family to something far more dangerous. Because if Shannon had discovered the truth that night, if she had confronted him about what they now knew, then whatever happened next wasn't an accident. And when detectives pulled up the final piece of data from Chris's phone, a detail he swore meant nothing, they realized the perfect husband story wasn't just cracking. It was about to shatter completely. The interrogation room smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down on purpose. Chris Watts sat alone at the metal table, shoulders slightly rounded, hands folded in front of him like a man waiting for instructions. The walls were bare, no windows, no distractions, just him, his story, and the quiet pressure of knowing it was starting to crumble. Detectives re-entered the room without raising their voices. They didn't accuse. They didn't threaten. Instead, they leaned into something far more dangerous for a man like Chris: patience. They asked him to tell the story again. This time, they focused on details, exact times, exact words, exact movements. What time did Shannon walk through the door? Where did the girl sleep? Did anyone wake up during the night? Chris answered, but the rhythm was off. His timeline shifted by minutes, then by hours. His explanations grew longer, more tangled. He began correcting himself mid-sentence, backtracking, adjusting. Each change was noted, each inconsistency stacked on top of the last. While Chris talked, investigators worked in parallel. At the oil site where he worked, security footage showed his truck arriving far earlier than usual that morning. He wasn't scheduled to be there alone, yet he was. GPS data from the truck placed him at a remote location, one he had personally requested to visit the night before. That wasn't a coincidence. That was preparation. Back in the interrogation room, detectives changed tactics. They didn't tell Chris what they knew. They told him what they believed. They spoke about stress, about relationships breaking under pressure, about how good men sometimes make terrible decisions in moments they can't take back. Chris nodded. His breathing changed. The calm facade flickered. They mentioned Shannon's messages, her fear, her suspicion, her heartbreak. They spoke about her pregnancy, about a future that now existed only on paper. For the first time, Chris's eyes filled with tears. He rubbed his face, shaking his head as if trying to physically remove the moment. Then came the question that shifted everything. Is there someone else, Chris? Silence. The room stretched tight. Chris stared at the table, jaw clenched, lips pressed together. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. The confession wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was devastating. He admitted to having an affair. He described it as something that just happened, something that made him feel alive again. He said he didn't want to hurt anyone. He said he felt trapped between two lives. Detectives didn't react. They let him talk. He spoke about wanting a fresh start, about how peaceful life felt without arguments, about imagining a future that didn't include Shannon or the responsibilities that came with her. As the words spilled out, something unsettling became clear. Chris wasn't grieving. He was relieved. Outside the room, investigators were now operating with certainty. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a removal. They brought in a specialist trained to read microexpressions and emotional responses. The specialist watched Chris through the one-way glass, noting how he spoke about his daughters in past tense, how he referred to Shannon as a problem rather than a person, how his emotional spikes came when he talked about himself, not when he talked about the missing family. Then they made their move. Detectives told Chris they had found evidence at the worksite. Not specifics, just enough to let his imagination do the damage. They said they understood things had gone wrong. They said this was his chance to explain before the story was told without him. Chris's hand began to shake. He asked if he was going to prison. It was the first time he'd acknowledged consequences. They didn't answer the question. Instead, they asked him to stand up. They led him out of the room, past offices and desks, into a quiet hallway. At the end of it was a door. Behind that door waited a man Chris trusted more than anyone else in the world. His father. The moment the door closed behind them, Chris collapsed into tears. The words poured out in fragments. Guilt, fear, desperation. He told his father there had been a fight. He said Shannon had hurt the girls. He said he lost control. It was a story designed to soften the truth, to share the blame, to make what came next seem less monstrous. But investigators listening nearby knew the truth already. Because at the oil site, beneath towering metal tanks and the endless stretch of Colorado plains, search teams had discovered something that could never be explained away. Evidence that didn't belong to a fight. Evidence that spoke of planning, not panic. And as Chris sobbed into his father's shoulder, telling a version of events he hoped might save him, detectives prepared to confront him with the one fact he could no longer escape. They had found where his family really went. And the truth waiting at that site was far worse than anything Chris Watts had admitted so far. The drive back to the interrogation room felt longer than it should
Your
have.
Honor, I swear I
Chris
didn't do
Watts
it.
sat silently,
Please, you
eyes
have to
fixed on the
believe me.
floor,
Order in the court.
as
I'll have
detectives
silence.
laid out what they had
Your
found
Honor,
at the oil site.
I swear I
They
didn't do it.
rush.
You've
They
got
didn't
to
raise their
believe me.
voices. They spoke with the steady certainty of people who already knew the ending to the story. Beneath the massive steel tanks where Chris had worked that morning, investigators had discovered evidence no lie could erase. Evidence that didn't point to a moment of rage, but to cold, deliberate choices made step by step. When Chris heard the words, his shoulders sagged. This time, there was no room left to maneuver. They asked him to tell the truth. Not a version shaped by fear. Not a story softened for family. The truth. And slowly, piece by piece, the perfect husband disappeared. Chris admitted that the argument with Shannon wasn't spontaneous. He admitted that the night she came home, he already knew what he wanted his future to look like, and who wouldn't be in it. He spoke about feeling trapped, about wanting freedom more than responsibility. He described the moments after the house went quiet, when the life he had built no longer mattered to him. As he spoke, the room seemed to close in. There were no dramatic outbursts, no shouting, just a man explaining the unexplainable with chilling calm. He talked about his daughters not as children, but as obstacles. About Shannon not as a person, but as a problem that needed solving. Detectives listened in silence, documenting every word. When the confession was complete, Chris Watts was taken into custody. The cameras followed him as he was led away. No longer concerned husband begging for answers, but a man exposed by his own lies. Within days, the evidence mounted beyond dispute. The affair, the messages, the timeline, the planning. Every piece aligned into a story so dark it stunned even seasoned investigators. The case moved quickly after that. Chris pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. In court, he stood shackled, head bowed, as the impact of his actions echoed through the room. Family members spoke. Friends spoke. And then Shannon's parents addressed the man who had destroyed their world. Their words were not loud. They didn't need to be. They spoke of birthdays that would never come, of children who would never grow older, of a future stolen not by a monster in the shadows, but by someone they once trusted completely. Chris said very little. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, multiple life sentences, stacked one on top of the other, ensuring he would never walk free again. The courtroom emptied, but the weight of the case lingered long after the doors closed. Prison life stripped away the last remnants of who Chris pretended to be. Inside his cell, there were no smiling neighbors, no news cameras, no carefully chosen words. Just concrete walls, metal bars, and endless time. Other inmates knew exactly who he was. His crimes followed him like a shadow, whispered in corridors, etched into his name. He was transferred between facilities for his own safety, living under constant isolation. And yet, even behind bars, the story didn't end. Months later, Chris gave another interview. This time, he admitted the full truth, details even investigators hadn't known. He spoke about planning, about thoughts that started weeks before the crime, about waking up the morning after and going to work as if nothing had happened. The calmness in his voice haunted everyone who heard it. There was no moment of redemption, no sudden realization that made sense of the horror. Just a man explaining how easily he had erased his own family. Shannon's friends turned their grief into purpose, speaking out about domestic violence, about warning signs that are often invisible until it's too late. The house where it all began was eventually sold, its walls repainted, its rooms emptied of the memories that once filled them. But the silence never truly left. Because this case wasn't about rage. It wasn't about a single bad decision. It was about deception. The lie of the perfect life. The lie of the devoted husband. The lie that no one would ever look closely enough to see the cracks forming underneath. Chris Watts didn't snap. He unraveled. And the interrogation that exposed everything didn't just reveal a crime. It revealed how dangerous a mask can be when no one realizes it's there. Today, Chris Watts wakes up every morning in a prison cell, knowing the world remembers him not as a man he tried to be, but as a truth he tried to hide. A truth uncovered not by force, but by patience, by listening, by letting a man talk long enough to destroy his own story. They thought they were searching for a missing family. Instead, they uncovered a calculated betrayal that ended in silence, steel doors, and a life sentence with no escape. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you question how well we ever truly know the people closest to us, remember this is only one case among many. The next story is even darker. Make sure you don't miss it.